policy framework and the ongoing engagement to create a poverty reduction strategy, a children's charter, and an approach to early childhood development, collectively referred to as Together We Raise Tomorrow. Leanne Wagner is the Executive Director of the Strategic Policy Initiatives Branch with Alberta Human Services. She's been with the Alberta Public Service for about 10 years and working in early childhood development and childcare. And prior to joining the Alberta Public Service, Leanne worked in Ontario for a children's mental health agency, the regional public health agency, and the Government of Ontario's Ministry of Community and Social Services. Leanne holds a BA in Political Science from Dalhousie University and an MA in Planning from the University of Waterloo. Please welcome Leanne Wagner.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry about that. That conversation was taking long, and sometimes with the community you never know how long the conversation is going to take, so I slipped out to read the newspaper. Not enough time. So, we got our numbers. So thank you very much for inviting me here to your annual general meeting and giving us an opportunity to share with you the story of Alberta's social policy framework. It's terrific to be in a room full of people who are board members and board volunteers, because the social policy framework was really part of the leadership for that was really driven by board members in Alberta. And without board members, we would not have been able to have the success that we had across Alberta with the social policy framework. So what I wanted to do this morning was give you a sense of, well, how did the province of Alberta come to creating a social policy framework? How do we build that framework, and what do we have, and how are we using it? Okay.
That should work. I don't know if it's on, so I might have to.
Find out. So back in 2010, when Premier Redford assumed leadership of Alberta, she created a ministry called the Ministry of Human Services. That ministry brought together what was formerly 5 ministries: seniors and community supports, housing and urban affairs, children and youth services, and employment and immigration, which was at that time our income support, employment training ministry. Those ministries, the bulk of them were brought together into one ministry called Human Services. Their smaller parts were spun off into other ministries. And our ministry has over $4 billion of spending every year. We are the largest staff group, because Alberta has a direct delivery model for a big chunk of its social services. So we in our ministry probably have 5,000 to 6,000 public service employees, making us the largest ministry in the government of Alberta. The intent by bringing human services together was to drive forward an agenda on integration and transformation. And it was seen as a core plank of her mandate around families and communities. And she gave, I think she was trying to give some breadth to that mandate by creating this super ministry, or the humongous ministry that people would often call us. And she gave it more credence by appointing one of the most senior and experienced ministers in her cabinet, which was the Honourable Dave Hancock. Mr. Hancock has been a cabinet minister for 16 years, and he has held almost every, what one would call the social portfolios in his term. He is a well-respected legislator, parliamentarian, and is a senior leader in the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta. So by creating this ministry, she was clearly signaling, and by putting him at the helm, she was clearly signaling, we desire change. And she asked Minister Hancock to lead the development of a social policy framework that would act as the blueprint for this integration agenda and transformation agenda. And she, in her mandate letter to him, clearly positioned that he was leading this on behalf of the government of Alberta. It was not to be viewed as a framework just for human services or traditional social services, but a framework that would stand alongside frameworks like the energy framework, our environmental policy frameworks, and some of our other education policy frameworks. So why create human services? Why embark on something as arcane and as policy wonky as a social policy framework? I think there was a sense that it was time for a second look at particularly traditional, what one would call traditional social services. Alberta has had social policy frameworks in the past. The last one was 30 years ago, led by the Getty government and implemented by the Klein government. It was called Caring and Responsibility. It had a tremendous influence, in hindsight, on the development of our social services system in Alberta. That framework really pushed forward an agenda, particularly around income support reform, around individual responsibility, and the need for individuals to be independent and self-sufficient. And it also drove out an agenda that services should be delivered by the community. So to the point now where Human Services has over 7,000 contracted agencies, and a significant portion of our $4 billion budget is delivered through third-party contracts with nonprofits or private bodies or post-secondary institutions. The sense was, okay, so it's 30 years later, look what we have. And we were starting to see some of the cracks and fragments from not having an opportunity to look at that over time. There are consequences to having that network of delivery bodies, and there are consequences to pushing out on a singular agenda around individual responsibility and self-sufficiency that people were starting to say, maybe it's time for us to take a look at this. Is this the right mindset for social services in our province now? The second was complexity, and I'm sure you've heard this, lots of people talk about how we live in a much more complex system, and the sense that the tools we have right now, the policy tools, the regulatory tools, the funding tools, are not up for the job of a complex service delivery system, nor of a province that has significantly changed in 30 years. Alberta is much more urban than it was 30 years ago, and urbanization is not just in the corridor anymore. The urbanization has expanded from a straight line between Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary to really a Y, from Grand Prairie to Fort Mac, into Edmonton, and then the inverse Y from Medicine Hat to Lethbridge. So there was that. There was also this sense that the needs of our populations were changing, that we were increasingly facing more complex cases and more complex operating environments. Demands from First Nations and Aboriginal organizations, demands from parents to be involved in service delivery. Those kinds of things were really calling on us to be a bit more fluid and perhaps a bit more intelligent, and I use that word in the sense of intelligent design kinds of thinking, not IQ, in how we organized ourselves. Alberta has one of the highest gaps of income disparity in the country. As measured by the Gini coefficient. People in Alberta do remarkably well. We have some of the highest incomes in the country in terms of median and average incomes. People can come to Alberta and they can become very prosperous. But we also have one of the most significant levels of poverty. So there was a sense of unease about where that was taking us as a province, that the prosperity was not for all of us. And then changing expectations, which I think we've all confront all the time about, people were telling us pretty consistently that the way we delivered services was not modern. That asking someone to come downtown where there was no parking between 8:15 and 4:30 to acquire services, to wait in line, to fill in forms, to bring paper, seemed not very smart. Particularly if they were working poor and the only time they could get off was noon, and we tend to shut our offices at noon. So what could we do to improve the technology and how we organized ourselves and the way we provided services? And then finally, sustainability challenges. We have a budget of $4 billion. There are incredible pressures on that budget for human services, for health, and for education. Human services is in a unique position in that we control almost none of the levers that drive our budget. We don't control inflation, we don't control how much people get paid, we don't control population growth, we don't control who comes into the province to live, and yet we are always confronted with those folks coming to our door. And there is less and less appetite by citizens to pay for services where they are unclear of the outcome. So we have a sustainability challenge within the province of Alberta, just like every province does, around social services. How do we generate efficiencies and effectiveness, and how do we make sure our programs are relevant, not only to those who receive those services, but to those who may feel they are the payers of those services. So we embarked on a social policy framework under Minister Hancock's leadership. The good news for us is that Minister Hancock is a policy wonk. He's kind of a policy geek, and he loves policy. He would actually love to be in this room having this conversation with you because he likes those, let's have big blue sky conversations. Let's talk about policy frameworks. Every ministry he has led, he's left them with a policy framework. So, so a framework is a rather funny little tool because it is not a strategy, nor is it an action plan. It is really a guide, it's a map, if you will, of where you want to go. And so we told folks, because we wanted to be very clear up front of what a framework was and what it wasn't. And so we identified that frameworks really have three purposes, and our framework would have three core purposes. One was to clarify who does what, and what are the outcomes that we expect from social policy, generally defined. It's intended to coordinate, act as a kind of a coordinating tool across ministries and across various actors within the system. And most importantly, and this is actually, you can't underestimate the importance of a tool like a policy framework to influence over an extended period of time, action and change. That is its probably most important currency, is influence. If you look where most governments spend a lot of time on policy frameworks is in the environmental, in the resource development, and in the energy sector. They don't necessarily say we're going to do A, B, C. They point to say this is where we're interested in going. So how do we embark on building a social policy framework? So when the ministry assigned a small team of 8 people to lead the work on behalf of Minister Hancock and his government colleagues. That team, this for those of you who may know government bureaucracies, that team was structured very purposefully. It was structured to be very close to the deputy minister and to the minister, with tremendous contact between those two. So it was given a lot of priority within human services and a lot of priority in terms of how the Redford government had organized decision making. In that, Minister Hancock likes big conversations, so he wanted us to design an engagement process that would ensure that this was obviously led by human services, but not owned by human services. It was very important to the government that they felt like, we don't want this to be the government of Alberta's social policy framework. We want this to be Alberta's social policy framework. So we were tasked with designing an engagement process that would kind of create that and also manage expectations. It's important to remember that when Premier Redford came into power, she came in on an agenda of families and communities, and she's had a lot of messages that were very positive towards the nonprofit, community benefit sector. For many folks in that sector, that was like a little bit of sunshine after many years of feeling like they were in the closet. So there was tremendous amount of expectations that we had to manage because a lot of people equated a social policy framework with significant increases in funding. And that's not what we were doing. And so we had to try to navigate that space to say, this is not about going and getting $50 billion for human services or for social services or for the community benefit sector. This is about where do we want to go, what kind of province do we want to live in, how do we work together, and what are we working for. So we designed an engagement process that really mobilized our networks, particularly within human services and across the core social policy ministries. It was designed to have broad reach. It was also designed to be open and transparent, which is very important for us because when we started talking to people in the early days of designing the social policy framework, they indicated to us that one of the big challenges for human services was that we, because of the former children and youth services perception of them being very secretive, that people thought we would be incredibly secretive, that we would not be transparent, and that would kill the process. Heavy emphasis on community conversations, big emphasis on let's be really focused in our engagement activities, particularly where we use our minister and our deputy minister and their colleagues. And let's open this up. Minister Hancock likes technology, and he said very early on, I did not have a wiki in my last engagement, I want a wiki. And we said, yes, Minister, of course. So went away and learned everything we could about wikis. So in the end, this just gives you a sense about the scale we had. We were fortunate in that because we used our networks, particularly our ministry, when we were brought together, we had 2 sets of community boards that were part of our ministry, came into our ministry. Those board members were often individuals who were members of other boards or were appointed, elected officials in municipalities. So we leveraged the daylight. We saw that as an opportunity, not as something we had to manage. So we went to them and said, we need your help. There's only 8 of us. We can't possibly go everywhere in this province, but you're already in communities, so we need you to help us. So that engagement had kind of core tools. One was a heavy emphasis on social media, big emphasis on using wikis, Facebook, Twitter, and try to drive people to a website. We posted every single community conversation, the result of every conversation on that website so people could see. We also posted every letter that was sent to our minister from stakeholder groups. That snapped open transparency because generally, you all know this, you've been around, I'm sure many of you, for a long time. You know that some groups come to the meeting and some groups come to the meeting and write a letter and some groups just write a letter. And then sometimes the folks who write a letter, no one ever knows what they said. And you're not sure if what they said in the meeting was the same as what they said in the letter. So we advised our minister that every letter he received from big influential associations needed to be posted on the website. He agreed, thinking that it would drive down the volume of letters. So he was saying, well, I won't get as many letters, so that's good. And it did drive down the volume of letters because that door was of kind of back channels, way of working was closed off to those groups. They had to come in to the public, they had to have their own conversations, or they had to participate in community conversations. The other piece that we did was that we knew that we were going to hear that marginalized people, who are often the people who benefit the most from social policy and good social policy, often face significant challenges in being part of those conversations. Because we design them often for people who are like yourselves, who have the resources, the time, and the capacity to come to meetings. So we provided a $750 grant to nonprofit groups to host community conversations. That grant was deliberately designed not to pay for the whole amount because we knew that nonprofits, some of them have a mandate to convene groups. So our sense was we will put in a bit to recognize that there is costs associated with democracy, but we know that you have to contribute too. You have to own some of this activity. That was designed to cover food, childcare, renting a room, hiring a facilitator. And then the last piece was that we had a strong emphasis on MLA engagement. And our minister spent a tremendous amount of time with his MLA colleagues, talking to them about the social policy framework, and we spend a tremendous amount of time using Twitter and providing them with opportunities to use Twitter. I know lots of people think Twitter schmitter, it's just an entertainment thing, but what we learned through that is that Twitter is actually a very influential tool. We noticed in early days of the engagement that Calgary was not participating in the same rates as the North was. And so we suggested to our minister that he tweet the mayor of Calgary, Nenshi, because he has some crazy following of like 60 to 70,000 people. So Minister Hancock tweeted him saying, I don't know, we have this thing, I don't remember what the tweet said exactly, it's only 100 characters or something, so it's pretty short. And then Nenshi tweeted that back out to all his followers, and we immediately saw an increase in participation from Calgary. So we use that process all the time to try to generate and get people in the room. So heavy emphasis on social media. These are some of the things we learned from that engagement. The first was we had to use tools that matched the context. Lots of folks really liked our engagement process within government and across the province and in other provinces. And our advice always is that worked for us because it worked for our context. That range of tools, that emphasis on social media worked for us. It's not necessarily going to work in the exact same way for everybody, because you may not have the same leadership, you may not have the same kinds of people, you may not have access to the same kinds of tools, nor may you have the same objectives. But for us, we spent a lot of time thinking about where are our stakeholders right now, and how do they want to participate? What's their sense of participation? How do they view us? What's their relationship to us? We also used existing relationships, and this was a big part of what we did in that myself and my other members of the leadership team for Social Policy Framework, our deputy minister, all of the ADMs for our ministry, were essentially charged with, you have to go out and you have to ask for help. I can't stress to you how different that is for civil servants. I can't speak for other provinces, but for Alberta, we don't normally say, can you help us? We normally say, we're here from the government, how can we help you? So we went out lots and lots to talk to board members. Our minister went out and talked to mayors and to local councillors. We mined every big stakeholder group we had, and we went to every one of their meetings. Someone went and said, how can you help us? This is important for you, it's important for us, so what can you do? How can you crack open your BlackBerry contact list or your Rolodex and get the word out about how important it is to participate? What we learned from that is that people were, in a lot of ways, our partners were desperate for us to ask for help. And we're kind of almost grateful. In a way, I don't say that grateful in a patronizing way, but like, okay, good, we're on the same page, we're trying to work together, thank you for asking. Because I can bring talent, resources, networks to bear on this conversation. For us, and I think this is, I think for you folks in your nonprofit sector, your nonprofit staff are a lot like ours. But for us, we had to spend a lot of time with staff within our own ministry. And what I learned was that, and we've been very clear, it takes about 4 times the effort to engage civil servants who are delivery people as it does community staff. So I don't know why that ratio exists. It may not exist here in British Columbia, but we, with our staff of anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 people, depending on how you count it, we really struggle to get them to engage and be part of this conversation. But their colleagues in the nonprofit sector, those frontline staff folks who deliver services on our behalf, were very involved and very engaged. So we have to continue to think about that. And I would encourage anyone who wants to kind of undertake kind of social policy framework, and you've got staff that you have to, inside government departments you need to engage, they take a lot longer. And then not everybody talks the same way we do. Not everybody talks about social policy framework. Right,
Almost no one.
Exactly, that's true. So we had to really, we had to stop using that word and use other words. Remarkably, we would go to conversations with youth who were in care or with others, and they clearly grasped what we were trying to do. But as long as we didn't have other words, we're building a social policy framework. We had to learn to engage early and often. Our engagement lasted almost 6 months, from June to last year till November. Lots of folks said to us, you cannot have an engagement in the summer, you can't do it, nobody's around, no one's going to participate, no one's going to show up. And our response was, oh, so when should we have it? Well, you can't have it in September, because that's when school starts. You can't have it in December, because that's Christmas. You can't have it January, February, because that's winter. You can't have it March, because of March break. You can't have it April, because if minister's not around, because the house breaks. So we learned, it doesn't actually matter, just start. Because we just were thinking, well, that leaves us 2 weeks in October. Minister's not available because he's in the house, and so we are just going to start talking to people. And we also, that whole piece about transparency, and we closed the feedback loop. I have copies of the larger document. We made a real deliberate effort in the 2 phases that we showed people how we changed the framework. So during the engagement, we heard from people who said you have to have equality, has to be in your framework. That word equality has to be in it. And we strongly felt, no, it does not. It doesn't, it just does not. And we advised our minister, no, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is a social policy tool, already has equality enshrined in it. Our human rights legislation already has equality enshrined in it. It would be redundant to put it in here. And we wrote that in a version of the framework and said to people, we heard you say you wanted equality, we're not putting it in because it's redundant. We're already required to promote equality in social policy. By higher level, way more influential tools than this will be. And generally people would just go, oh, okay, and then move on. We did not have that confrontation that we often had where if we didn't explain ourselves and it wasn't there, they would get, you've been in those conversations with governments where you're not sure why they went where they went. And we did that on a couple of key pieces where we said to folks, this is why we put this in, this is why we took this out. And it seemed to promote trust, and people then wanted to participate because they knew we were listening to them and we were trying to be really clear about why we were choosing some of the tools we were choosing in the Word. And we learned that you have to have a plan about how you're going to manage all that feedback. We had over 31,000 participants, over 200 and close to 300 community conversations. Our benchmark for success was 60, because we knew Minister Hancock had come out of an education dialogue where there had been 60 community conversations. So we thought, oh, if we get 61, oh, perfect. That's work. And then the next would have thought, well, whoever gets next will have to do 62. But we ended up doing 300. So we kind of blew that target out of the water. We ended up with over 100 comments on our wiki where we posted the framework and said to people, you can change this. And lots of folks said, oh, 100, it doesn't matter. But you have to remember, they only had 5 pages to comment on. Imagine a Word document with track changes of 100 comments. There's a lot of dense feedback. So we had a lot of people participate in that engagement. It was probably the most successful engagement the province of Alberta has ever run in social policy. But you need to have a plan because we had all this feedback. We had pictures, we had poems, we had videos, because we said just talk in whatever way you want to talk. Here are the big questions we're asking, just talk how you want to talk. You can use our forms, you don't have to use our forms. You can, it doesn't matter, just as long as you'd tell us somewhere how this video matches what question we're trying to answer. So we had, little emails, and people would just write us an email. Some people would write us letters, some people went on the wiki, some people went on the survey, and we had community conversations. So we had to have a plan how to measure all that feedback because it's not traditional survey data. We had very unhappy staff for 6 weeks in September and October as they mined all that data. So why were we so successful in that engagement? Well, the first was that everybody was committed to listening and to not have a sense of defense. We're not here to defend. We were very clear. We're not here to rip apart the past. And we do not feel compelled to defend decisions made by the government of Alberta in terms of how it organized social services. We're here to listen. We're here to answer any questions. But it was very much, we're here to listen. And in a neutral, very neutral kind of way. We asked for help, as I said, and we believe that leadership, our leadership, particularly our minister and our deputy minister, believed that the process, how we developed this framework, was as important as the framework. So that frame, took 6 months to put that together. That is a long engagement time, and we knew we had to be done by March of this year. So we didn't have a lot of time, but we knew we had to spend lots of time on that process and figure out how to organize ourselves. And we were prepared to support people in that process of engagement. So the grants, we trained staff in how to host their own so that if we had facilitators in Grand Cache or Conklin, somebody could go out, it didn't have to be us, someone in that community could go out and lead that conversation if the community was unable to find, or the group was unable to find a facilitator. So wherever we generally thought about this as wherever normally you think of something as a problem, we tried to flip it into an opportunity. So, oh my gosh, we have over 7,000 contracted agencies, what a nightmare. We're never going to get them on the same page. Our thought was, oh, we don't have to. We just need to hear from them. How are we going to there's no way that 8 of us can travel all over Alberta. We don't have that kind of time or resources. Oh, we have all these staff. So why don't we just train them in how to lead these sessions? Minister, how do we get business involved? Well, we use our minister to do that. So our minister went out and talked to chambers and rotaries, and that's where he spent his time. He didn't go to a lot of community conversations. We dedicated his time to where we knew that his influence would make sense. Same with our deputy minister. So we just tried to find ways to support people in ways that made sense for them to participate. So now we have a framework. I think we handed out the 1-pager that we did, and I have copies of the long version as well, but I don't have logs, but it's available on our website. So a couple pieces I just want to share with you about what is different about this. In the Westminster parliamentary model, Cabinet often gets the final decision about, well, most likely always gets the final decision about a government direction. And the traditional policymaking process is, I, as a civil servant, provide some advice to my minister. Minister decides on his option. He or she then takes it forward to Cabinet, and that is a complete closed loop. Nobody knows what went to Cabinet. Nobody knows what happened there. We decided to crack that open. So we published the framework that was going to go to Cabinet on the website. And we said, here's where we are. Here's what we got, folks. You have 2 weeks to take a look at this before we wrap this up. If there's anything in here that really freaks you out, makes you really angry, you have to tell us. And that was very much our minister was, I don't know if he was being a rabble-rouser or he was trying to poke the center or what he was up to, but he was totally comfortable with, no, let's crack it open. Let's give him that chance. He was also very deliberate in that he did not want Cabinet to approve the framework, that they would endorse the framework. Just like the United Way of Calgary was going to endorse the framework. Just like the Edmonton Community Foundation was going to endorse the framework. So when we went to Cabinet, we asked for their endorsement of the framework. One of the questions we had from the cabinet office was, well, why is this even coming here? Because you already published it. It's done, isn't it? And where's the big unveil? Like, where's the reveal? Right? So they had a hard time with like, what? Where's the unveil? Like, it's not. What's the announcement gonna look like? It's gonna be boring. Everyone's gonna have seen it. And we structured that announcement very deliberately to be an endorsement announcement. Our minister and premier spoke for very little time at that. Most of the time was devoted to business reps talking about endorsing the framework. Nonprofits, private foundations, talking about what this framework was going to do. So it's a very different kind of announcement than what we traditionally often do with the big unveil of the check. And people, like that wasn't, we didn't have that. And those endorsements came from our minister and our deputy working their networks and saying, so what do you think? Do you want this? And then we also heavily relied on our nonprofit leaders as well to talk to people about, are we on the right track, before the big endorsement. So there's a lot of time spent laying the groundwork for that final period. So this framework is a traditional framework. There's nothing really, remarkable about how we laid it out or the table of contents. It looks like any kind of, this is what a framework normally is, it's a traditional table of contents. So there's nothing magical about that piece. That's actually the easiest piece. That was the first part we wrote. So I'm going to walk you through the elements of the framework and just give you a sense about where we have shifted and note that shift. So the first piece, and this was added during the engagement, was this notion of what are the overall big goals of social policy. And this was added because people were saying, particularly the business community said to us, what do we do? I get why we have environmental policy, I totally get it. Protect water, forests, air, get it. I even get why we have education policy or economic development policy. I do not get why they would say to us, I don't get social policy. Like, what are we doing? And this came from very influential business leaders in our community. In the oil and gas industry, who said, I just don't get it. So we added this to speak to that. These are fairly traditional social policy goals. This isn't, rocket science, I wouldn't say. Two pieces that are really important because there's themes throughout the whole framework. The first was create a person-centered system of high-quality services. That whole notion of how do you create high-quality services. And enable collaboration and partnerships. Those are two that are not necessarily always found in the literature around social policy, traditional literature around social policy. We added those two based on the engagement. We put in place a vision for social policy. This vision was rewritten 3 times during the engagement by participants in a variety of formats. They fixed our grammar, told us it was too bureaucratic, it was really boring. So, and it was, we were like, well, yeah, it is, because bureaucrats wrote it, so. But I want to highlight a couple concepts in this. The concept of everyone. Previous social policy frameworks in Alberta is focused on the vulnerable. This one focused on everyone. And this dyad of concepts between opportunity and contribution. That we heard fairly consistently that Alberta is a place of great opportunity. That we know we're a province where many people migrate to our province for economic opportunities and for the quality of life. But we expect, Albertans expect, that when you do that, when that happens, that you must contribute. In whatever way makes the most sense for you. That does not mean that everyone contributes to the same level or to the same scale, but that there's a sense of that's how we get belonging here. By acknowledging that we have great opportunity, that there's a sense of contribution. We identified some, so that's the top parts of this one-pager, social policy on one page. We identified 2 sets of outcomes. At first we only had 1 set, and then we heard during the engagement people said, well, it's great that you have outcomes for people, but what about the system of services that we spend $4 billion a year on? Plus, for probably anywhere from up to 20, 30 billion a year. So we identified, and these are pretty traditional outcomes. I'm not, there's nothing, I wouldn't say like, people look at these and go, wow, totally, that's really new. It's not. These are pretty standard kinds of outcomes. How we're using them, I think, is different. But you can see that those concepts of high quality services gets woven in by having a set of outcomes for that. And the concept of everyone and opportunity and contribution are woven throughout these outcomes. The sense of how do you make people feel included? How do you make people secure and resilient? And then we had service system outcomes for the service delivery system. These are not as snappy as the people outcomes are, and we try to make them snappy, but it's good as a living document because we ran out of steam. Honestly, at one point you just are like, oh, we have nothing left here. I don't know, this is the best we got. So, so honestly, everybody was going, he said they don't rhyme. I was like, no, they sure don't. So, we've been at this for 3 solid months, so I just much of it yet. So here's our best advice, ministers. So that policy is aligned, this notion of balance that we all strive for, that every system in this country is struggling with. How do you reorient systems from crisis to prevention? That they're more accessible, that they're accountable and sustainable, and this is a very important point about this accountable and sustainable. We heard loud and clear from people who were either service delivery recipients or those who were not part of the community benefit or nonprofit sector that they felt that accountability needed to be shared with them. The accountability did not lie just with government. They would say things to us, and these are people who have no experience. They're donors or they're aware that they felt that sure, a government has to be accountable, but so does the community benefit sector, particularly when it is a recipient of a government contract. That they have an obligation to be more transparent and to demonstrate outcomes. And that the roles are complementary. We identified some principles. Again, these principles are not, I think, are pretty standard. 2 principles I will draw your attention to because they are very, I think, really grounded in an Alberta context. This concept of dignity was a very important concept for our minister and for the government. That we need to have services that don't make people feel less than. We heard consistently throughout the engagement that particularly for human services and those that are traditional social services like income support and child welfare, that people experienced us, our delivery, as trying to make people feel less than. And that it was simply not okay. So this was very much through that dialogue with government caucus members and with key influence leaders. This concept of dignity was very important for the government as one of the parties in this. The second was this concept of mutual responsibility. So in Alberta, I talked about that 30 years ago, we had a social policy framework that was all about caring and responsibility, particularly individual responsibility. Over 30 years, that got translated into, even though it doesn't say that in the original framework, but that got translated into pull up your bootstraps, right? That's what people heard. And by the late 2000s, the community was starting to feel like that, it's just running out of steam. Like how there are some people who are working hard. They're doing all the right things. They've got a job, they're paying taxes, their kids go to school. They're doing all the right things, and yet they're not successful, and they are needing help. Or that, how do you tell someone who has paid taxes their entire lives, never had any contact with the social services system, and shows up with an ailing adult parent that they need help with, and they can't get help, and they're told to pull up their bootstraps? It does not go over very well. And that people were saying, we can't, there was just a sense that language we got to get out of that language. However, there was a sense that, look, this doesn't mean we're going to do everything for you. You still have some responsibility, that whole concept of opportunity and contribution. So the language we chose to shift towards was mutual responsibility. We heard during the engagement people said, oh, that's just code for pull up your bootstraps. It's just newfangled language. And our response was, if we wanted to say individual responsibility, we would have said it. We didn't, we just purposely chose mutual responsibility. That was a purposeful choice on the part of the team and the part of the advice we gave our minister and on the conversations we had with people. But that was a very important concept to start to shift away from that whole like pull up your bootstraps notion. Then there, which isn't in here because we only had so much room on this one pager, but we had a conversation with folks at the beginning of a conversation on roles and responsibilities. And that conversation was intended to start to talk about, so what's the role of the nonprofit, what's the role of government, what's the role of the community sector. We did not make any firm decisions, because that's a hard conversation to have. And people are really nervous, and they, my sense was that while we had generated a lot of trust, that the nonprofit sector was not prepared to have that conversation with us, because they felt like they even give us an inch, we'll take 300 miles. So we couldn't get very far with it. As far as we got was tabling a list of, here are all the players, here's their high level responsibilities. And that, we'll just continue that conversation over the next couple of years as we take a look at our system. We've identified some shifts, because people said, so what's that all going to mean? What are we going to see that's different? And so we've identified some shifts. One of the shifts we identified is that was very controversial and continues to be controversial, is that less of government as a service provider, a regulator and a funder, and more of a convener, an enabler, and an influencer. People took that to mean that we were no longer going to fund social services. No, we have statutory obligations. Those aren't changing. All we're saying is that should not be our only role, to regulate behavior, and to fund things. That shouldn't be our only role, and it's often not our most important role. If you look at the success of our 10-year plan to end homelessness, one of the reasons why it was so successful is that government used its influence to bring developers, private foundations, the housing community together to say, how do we end homelessness? And it said our policy is going to be housing first. By doing that, the whole system shifted to a housing first model. So we said we need to do more of that, as opposed to trying to spend our way. We need to get people to come together. But it was very much interpreted as we're bailing, which was our intention at all. So how are we using the framework? As I said, we're using it to clarify some roles. We're using it to coordinate action on some transformational initiatives that we identified. We're going to use it to monitor progress and also to continue the dialogue. And I have a few examples. So we identified a number of strategic initiatives or leading initiatives, or what do you want to be, transformational initiatives, where we believe that the work of these initiatives would fully demonstrate the power of the social policy framework. So we are engaged in a conversation around how do we eliminate child poverty in 5 years in Alberta. How do we turn the trajectory of 25% of Alberta's children coming to school not ready to learn? How do we move that number down? And how do we transform our system of services and ensure that people are engaged and part of the dialogue? So we use the framework in a couple of core ways already, and we were using it while it was being developed. The government was already starting to use it while it was being developed. So I'm just going to talk about, I'm going to give you 3 examples. So the first is, we just finished a conversation on poverty reduction and early childhood development. And that conversation was really grounded inside the social policy framework. It pulls out a lot of those concepts about how are we going to end child poverty? What roles are we all going to play? Because provincial government has this much space. Municipalities have a little bit of space, and the community benefit sector, nonprofit sector has some space. So we, Government of Alberta, are not going to resolve poverty by ourselves. We're very clear with the community. There's no way we can do that, nor should we. We need to bring in other parties into that conversation. Same is true for early childhood development. On top of that is the Children's Charter. will be used to review all programs. It'll be the first provincial children's charter, and it's enshrined in legislation. And that's intended to kind of drive out an outcomes focused on children. The second way we're using it is results-based budgeting. The government of Alberta implemented legislation that every program must undergo a review every 3 years. We are currently in the process of, right now, over the next 6 months, we're reviewing 111 programs. With the sense of how do we answer the question of are they relevant, are they effective, and are they efficient? In order to answer the effective question, you need outcomes. And in the past, generally how we did that was children and youth services had some outcomes, and education had some outcomes, and health had some outcomes, and culture had some outcomes, and we ended up with an enormous list of outcomes, 40 outcomes, that you could measure. How do you measure 40 outcomes? The government of the day, the deputy ministers who were leading that work said we need one set of outcomes in the cluster of ministries that are socially oriented. Those outcomes will be these outcomes in the social policy framework. Every program is going to have to demonstrate how it's effective against these outcomes. So for the first time ever, when we did the early childhood development review, education and health and human services had to use one set of outcomes. That's how you drive alignment, that's how you drive coherence. The other example, which I'm sure you heard about, it was I think a little less popular, was that whole concept around opportunity and contribution in the disability bundle of services. That program is being reoriented towards a core focus on employment and inclusion. And so, because the expectation is that everyone contributes, everyone has opportunities. So that program, in terms of its macro policy and what we provide for people with disabilities, is shifting its focus and probably very quickly towards how do we ensure that people with disabilities are included in their communities in meaningful ways. As opposed to ways where they're in the community, but they're not necessarily employed or volunteering or visible. So how do we do that? So that's the other, through results-based budgeting, they drove the social policy framework through that. We also have a huge agenda around transforming how we deliver services. We've just started in a public way implementing that work. If we have an expectation of system of high quality services, how do we do that? So the government, particularly human services, is trying to figure out how do you take, I don't know how many programs we have, but we have about 8 major program areas, often with the same clients. How do you organize those programs so that they provide better services? How do you use technology? How do we get staff to span across transitions, things like that? And then how do you transform relationships? Because if you know, there's a whole emphasis around collaboration in that framework. And our minister just announced, and I think it's almost through reading, the establishment of what's called Family and Community Engagement Councils. These will replace the current boards that our ministry has. Those boards were essentially established to monitor delivery and be relationship oriented over time. There was just a general conclusion by the board members themselves and by the ministry that that relationship piece was stronger than the operations piece. The operations piece was very hard for them, not because they did lack talent, but because of accountabilities that government has. So we just announced the establishment of what we're calling Family and Community Engagement Councils, whose core job, one of their core jobs will be in communities to have conversations with communities about how are we doing on working out those outcomes that were enshrined in the social policy framework, and providing that advice back to the minister and to the government. The other piece is that we continue to have conversations, and this is going to take us a little longer, about our relationship with the nonprofit sector in human services. We have 7,000 contracted agencies. We don't actually really know very much about them. So we started some early work internally within the ministry around that, and also some exploratory work around that whole concept of social innovation to see what we can do there. All driven very much with a strong agenda on collaboration, transformation. So we tend to use this framework as a lens. You know a framework is successful when people in the community repeat it back to you. And say, so, you know, social policy framework says this. So how do we do that together? We use it as a planning tool to establish priorities. So those transformational initiatives are the core set of actions, particularly human services, health and education are focused on in the social policy arena. We're not focused on 10,000 things, we're focused on about 8 things. So if you want to come talk to us, here's our list of priorities. This is what we're driving on. It helps clarify for the community what's important to us right now. We use it as a model for engagement. As I talked about, we're going to push out, trying to make this social policy framework a bit more of a living document with the engagement councils. Provides common language and vision, which I don't think, if you're trying to establish a system of services, language is probably one of the most important things you can do. Language is part of culture, and if you want a culture, you're going to have a common language. The framework is that common language. And it's also a big focus on innovation and collaboration. So much more of a openness and willingness by governments and ministries to partner in different ways with stakeholders. So, you know, for example, in our conversation around social innovation, we're interested in what do we think about social finance? There are a few groups in the province who are thinking about social finance. They've actually got proposals. We brought them in to review those proposals and test out the policy assumptions with our colleagues in Treasury Board and Finance and other ministries. That would never have happened 5 to 10 years ago, where in a non-binding, non-confrontational way, you both try to figure out, is this the right tool? And then have the opportunity to talk, you know, with our respective governing bodies about, yeah, maybe, or no, we don't know. But in a much more transparent, open way than we have in the past. So that is social policy framework in about, I don't know, 45 minutes.
So, Leanne, is that, can we have that
Oh, yeah.
presentation?
Absolutely.
Questions?
Rick?
I'm here until like 4 o'clock, so
Thank you very much.
you're welcome.
How did you engage community representatives in planning and carrying out the consultation process? Question 1. And 2, how did you go about engaging in that consultation process First Nations, immigrants, newcomers, marginalized communities?
Sure.
Be sure that they were part of it.
Yep. So the one we did is that we early on took out, developed kind of a process map of the engagement with like, here's our core principles about how we want to operate, here's some of the tools we're thinking about, and we shopped that around to trusted partners within human services, culture, and health, and education to say, so this is what we're thinking about doing, what do you think, are we off track? Before we ever announced anything. So it was kind of, we went out very early to talk to our board members who were part of those authorities. We talked to some key influence leaders that were identified by our deputy minister or by our minister. You know, talked to some friends, some friendly people that were, you know, friendly with our minister. So that, just to make sure that it was going to make sense and it was going to be relevant to them. In terms of those marginalized populations, I wouldn't say marginalized, but those special populations, we were, you know, in retrospect, we were not very successful with First Nations. So Alberta has a reserve system, and we have 3 treaties, and that process is takes a really long time. To go out and talk to the Grand Chiefs, and talk to all the 40, 50 odd chiefs, talk to band administrators, chief portfolio officers, and so we we did do a bit of the political work with our minister and the Grand Chiefs and some of the chiefs, but we just did not, they need a lot longer time. You know, they would talk to us, well, the process we really liked was this one that took 2 years. And it was very much government to government, and we just did not have that kind of time. So, you know, their criticism, and it's a fair criticism, is that you didn't engage us. So that's a totally fair criticism. But it's an ongoing challenge for a ministry like Human Services, just because of the amount of time those communities often require, just does not match the time allocation we're given. So we just really struggle with that. And I don't know how, yeah, that's a constant question for us right now in our ministry. The other groups, immigrants, youth, people with mental illness, because we sent out emails. We had a stakeholder list of over 5,000 people. We had all these emails for all our contracted agencies, and we just collected emails like crazy people. Minister Hancock sent out personal emails to every single contracted agency, and to, I mean, personal as much as they look personal. And said, you know, I need your help. We're not the experts in talking to people who are new Canadians. We're not the experts in talking to youth who've been in care. I'm not a bad facilitator, but I am not a facilitator trained in how to work with youth at risk. That's a special set of skills. We need your help because you have that. So can you lead a group? And there's a grant, $750. There's a kit that is like an unpack a conversation, had everything in it. Had the posters to advertise, had the newsletter articles, had everything. And asked them, and they did. Like we had lots, we had people who live with mental illness. We had homeless people because the homeless groups had those conversations. Youth at risk, new Canadians, and then off-reserve Aboriginal groups participated to a tremendous level, but not First Nations, not the reserve organizations. But off-reserve, we had tremendous success.
We've got more questions coming.
I just want to mention that their website is amazing. Like it's all there from day one.
Yep.
And tools and templates and like it's all there.
And I'll just say that Ontario stole our templates.
So we're going to steal it again.
Steal with
Yeah,
pride.
they just changed the colors. That's our templates.
It's all blue and green, but
Yeah, it was like
Got a
there's
question down there first.
these red.
One here, one there, and there's another one. Okay. And then we're going to have, we're going to have to stop, take a quick break, and then move into the next phase. And I know that our students where are our students here?
Right here.
Right here. Okay.
right and furious.
They want a chance to meet with Leanne, so maybe after we take this break, you can find a place to hang out for a while and have that conversation, and we'll have a broader conversation as well. And right after we end this session, I want to meet with the board at a stand-up meeting down at the end of the hall, if we could, okay? Because we're like we have been throughout this entire conference, running out of time. So, let's go.
Just very quickly then, you say you're in third reading with the bill, and obviously you're changing a lot of legislation. So
Yep,
is
we
this
are.
an omnibus bill, and have you got buy-in, or do you have to do like 3 years of changes in?
No. So we did an omnibus bill for the Children's Charter, which was the first, I think, omnibus bill for social services Alberta's seen. And no, we don't have to do, the government does not have to do tremendous consultation on legislation, because their argument is, we did one, we had 31,000 people participate, so we don't. Our minister's also the House Leader. And he loves legislation, which is a bit of a drag for us, because I think we just someone counted in the last 5 months, we've changed 17 regulations. So he's a heavy, he likes legislation. So, no, he's very well respected parliamentarian. The Children's Charter, he reached out to his opposition colleagues, and they made amendments to that the government accepted. So, we're very fortunate to have such an experienced a man as our leader. So we're very lucky.
Question about accountability, which is one of those I guess perhaps the most value-laden
Yeah,
terms
sure.
that I met intended there. And your results-based budgeting, which sounds scary.
Yep.
Some of us, thank you. And the determination whether the programs are relevant,
Yep.
effective, and then efficient. So the relevance and effectiveness, I'm fairly comfortable with that. It's the efficiency
Yeah.
part. Could you speak to that a bit? Who determines that? Is it one size fits all efficiency, or is it program by program?
So how that process gets worked out right now is that, there's challenge panels that are comprised of MLAs and community members who have an opportunity to look at the review plan and the measures of efficiency for each of the program bundles. What I think the two bundles that have gone forward so far, early childhood development and disabilities, they struggled with efficiency measures. We don't have as many as we think we do. So we have to get better at that. Where we seem to share some promise around efficiency is in our child intervention system, which is surprising. In that they, over the last 5 years, have been implementing outcomes-based, what they call an outcomes-based service delivery model, which is a contracting model. And they work with the vendor, or a group of vendors, to identify the outcomes and the measures together. And that process seems to have been generating some promise for us. We're not sure if it's a trend or if it's an event, in that we're starting to see our caseload, particularly our First Nations caseload. Alberta has one of the highest proportions of Aboriginal kids in care in the country. That caseload seems to be, but we don't know if it's a trend or an event, over the last 6 months has started to slow down, and the outcomes seem to be getting better in terms of permanent placements. So, I think, efficiency is often in the eye of the beholder, right? And who's the payer, often. So we're trying to be much more collaborative in that, but I think it's a work in progress, because we just got a set of shared outcomes. So now we have to figure out how to measure that.
So I got two questions, real quick. I noticed in the early part of it, there was a number of things where you said, this is pretty standard, this is pretty standard, these two are kind of different. How much of that early piece was about educating and bringing the public along and getting buy-in? And then my second question is, what's the biggest bang out of this whole thing? What's, to you, what's
Right,
the
from
biggest
my
piece?
perspective, sure. Given that we hadn't had a framework for 30 years, and there was just this general sense amongst deputy ministers in that policy arena, and that we need a blueprint, because it's not, where are we going, what are we doing? And I think that key influence leaders in the communities, particularly United Ways, private funders, and others, were asking government that. So what are you doing? Now, today we're interested in this, tomorrow we're interested in that, then we're interested in this, then we're interested in that, you're transforming, you're doing, what are you doing? And we can't keep up, we don't even know where to spend our time anymore with you. So we kind of don't want to. So, well, they didn't say it like that, of course, that's my paraphrasing, but that's what I heard. Sorry. So, I think though that was a conversation amongst a group of people who said, we've got to, and there's a great opportunity there. We had a deputy minister who was interested in it, we had a minister and a premier who were open to the idea, and there were groups who had been kind of churning away at social policy frameworks for a number of years. College of Social Workers had one. So, I think there was just this general sort of sense of we need a blueprint for the system. Your second question in terms of what's the biggest bang for a buck, I think the biggest bang for the buck for our ministry was that we generated a tremendous amount of goodwill. Human Services, you can't underestimate as a government department goodwill. We cut into it a bit with the changes we made into PDD, to a certain extent, persons with developmental disabilities, but we got a lot of goodwill out of that. And we got people feeling like we had a plan. Even though they don't agree, they may not agree with the plan, and they may be skeptical about our ability to execute ending child poverty, or turning the curve on the 25% of kids not ready to go to school. But they understand that there's a plan, and that there's a story. A bigger narrative, I think, is really important. So when the FCEs, the Family and Community Engagement Councils, came out, people understood it Because you get those you get electronic newsletters from various groups, and they place it in the context of the social policy framework for their members. This is why this is happening, because of this. So I think that you can't underestimate goodwill and the importance of a narrative in a complex system. People need those stories to understand, what am I doing? Why am I here? Right? Who are you? What do you want? How can I help you? That kind of thing.
Last question, Donna.
Okay, so just quick, I'll try to be quick. First thing, I'm just wondering how, like you mentioned just now briefly that there was the College of Social Workers
Yep.
had a framework.
Yep.
They did a revision of it in 2012.
Yep.
I guess the piece that I'm not as clear on is how did you engage professional organizations, government employees?
Yep.
So we talked about,
Yep.
the not-for-profit or the benefits,
Yep.
benefit sector, so that piece.
Yep.
Because it seems to me they're going to be implementing
Oh, for sure.
stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then secondly, I heard what you said, and I think it's great around the issue of government as an influencer,
Yep.
convener, and partner. And then your slide said less funder.
Yep.
And I just, that's
Yeah, no,
good.
for sure. It's bad
But the
communication.
question
Yep.
still is there.
Absolutely.
Like,
Fair
the
enough.
question of funding, and it's easy. I can see why people would think maybe downloading. Just,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just
Absolutely.
those two pieces.
So your first piece about the College of Social Workers, we met with them. Our minister met with them a number of times about their framework and what they learned from their experience and their knowledge. Everyone had the same opportunity to participate. That was really important for us. So we did not have very many special meetings. So the College of Social Workers, the College of Registered whatever,
Yeah.
insert profession, had the same opportunity to participate as the little tiny neighborhood center. You had the kit. If you were a nonprofit, you get $750. You could come online. You need a facilitator, give us a call, we'll see what we can do for you. The only groups I would say that would get special meetings, where it made sense to have a special meeting, were business leaders, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, or key business leaders. Because they're not going to host a group. Like Chamber of Commerce, they go to them and say, we have this kit, do you want to host a focus group? They were like, no. We have a lunch, the minister can come talk. So that everyone had the same participation. So we had the College of Social Workers very active in getting their members to participate. And there were a few other groups that participated.
Government employees?
So the Alberta Union of Public Employees did not participate formally. We did not get a formal submission from them. Federation of Labour and some of their advocacy groups participated. Public Interest Alberta, which is their policy arm, participated. And our staff, I think I said we had a really hard time engaging them like that. And it was in terms of effort, for every 1 hour I put into getting a nonprofit to participate, I had to put 4 hours to getting a staff team to participate. And it was very, we did lots internally. Like we had contests, we had Wiki Wednesdays, where if you went on the wiki, you could get a Tim Hortons card. We had like special sessions with the minister and deputy minister, a lot of effort. And I think they participated. Those who were interested participated, and so I don't know if a part of me is like, do you take silence as tacit agreement? And it could also be delivery staff are a little bit like, good Lord, what do you do when you policy geeks, right? Like, get over it. Like it could be that too, right? I couldn't figure out, is it a tacit agreement, if it's eye rolling because you're just wah. So I could never get a handle on that, because they would think, and those who participated provided really great feedback. And we were very deliberate about pulling their feedback in, because they often provided tremendous insights, and some participated in led groups, and some of them had lunch hour sessions. But for a big corporate organization like us, one of our lessons learned was we completely underestimated the volume of effort required to engage staff. And so we had two things where we probably, in reflection, we didn't do great on, and where we get criticized, it's fair criticism, was on First Nations, political leadership of First Nations, that's fair, and on just how do you get staff, particularly government staff, to participate?
I just want to say thanks. I was expecting kind of dry. This is just like, wow, my head hurts. Thank you so much for coming. A little token of our
Oh, thank you very
appreciation
much.
to you. Thank you so much.
Leanne, I want to say, we're going to invite you back in a year or two, and we're going to show you our policy framework. So we're going to take a 10-minute, it's going to be 20, but it's going to be 10 now. And would all of the board, the new members as well as the current members, go to the end of the hall. We're going to have a quick little choosing the executive for the new board. Thanks.